The orchestra's haunting waltz drifted through the gilded ballroom like smoke through ruins. Emma Drake stood alone near the marble pillar, her unseeing eyes aimed toward the warmth of the chandelier above, while whispers circled her like vultures. "The ghost of the gala," someone murmured. 10 years since she killed her mother. Malcolm Drake commanded the room's center, his silver hair catching light like a crown, accepting condolences he'd weaponized into empire. Thomas Kellen watched from the service corridor, his janitor's uniform, making him invisible, his weathered hands still against his mop handle. Asterisk. But what if the ghost wasn't the one who should be haunted? What if the real killer stood in plain sight, bathed in golden light, while his victim bore the blame? Sometimes the truth needs just one dance to awaken. The annual Drake Foundation Gala for Road Safety sprawled across the top floor of the Meridian Hotel, a cruel irony that Emma had long since stopped fighting. Every April 15th, on the anniversary of the crash that had stolen her sight and her mother, Malcolm Drake transformed their tragedy into spectacle. The room hummed with the particular frequency of wealth, the whisper of silk, the bright notes of champagne flutes meeting, the practiced laughter that never quite reached anyone's eyes. Emma's fingers traced the cool marble behind her, mapping her position in the vast space. The pillar stood exactly 17 steps from the service hallway, 43 from the main entrance. She'd counted them earlier, when Helen, her nurse companion, had guided her in through the crowd that parted like she carried plague. Now Helen stood somewhere to her left. Emma could smell her lavender hand cream, hear the particular rustle of her starched uniform, maintaining her post as both caregiver and warden. "Such a shame," floated a voice from a cluster of donors near the auction table. "You'd think after 10 years he'd stop putting her on display." "Malcolm says it helps her," another responded. Being part of these events, honoring her mother's memory. Emma's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She'd learned years ago that reacting only fed the narrative her father had crafted. The damaged daughter, forever frozen at 16, forever guilty, forever needing his protection. The media loved it. The board members who kept Malcolm secure in his CEO position at Drake Industries loved it more. Nothing quite like tragedy to make a corporate titan seem human. Across the room, Thomas Kellen pushed his supply cart along the wall, invisible in the way service workers became at events like these. At 38, he'd been cleaning the floors of Chicago's elite venues for 6 years, ever since Amanda's death had left him alone with Maeve in a mountain of medical debt. Tonight, like every night, he worked the late shift so Mrs. Chen next door could watch his daughter. The overtime from events like these meant Maeve could stay in her good school, could keep her violin lessons. But tonight, something made him pause. Maybe it was the way Emma Drake stood so perfectly still, like she was holding her breath underwater. Maybe it was how the crowd unconsciously maintained a precise radius around her, as if blindness might be contagious. Or maybe it was simply that he recognized the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who refused to truly see you. Malcolm Drake's voice rose above the general murmur, that practiced baritone that could make shareholders swoon and competitors sweat. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." The room quieted immediately, bodies turning toward him like flowers to Sunday tonight marks 10 years since we lost Catherine. 10 years since my daughter Emma survived what should have been unsurvivable. Emma's fingers pressed harder against the marble. She knew this speech. Every word, every calculated pause, every moment when his voice would catch just enough to seem genuine. She could feel the room's attention split between Malcolm and her, their gazes like heat on her skin. "The police said Emma grabbed the wheel," Malcolm continued, his voice dropping to force the crowd to lean in, a teenage moment of rebellion that went tragically wrong. "But I've never blamed my daughter. How could I? She was just a child. She's suffered enough, lost enough." "Haven't you, sweetheart?" The endearment carried across the room like a slap. Emma forced her expression to remain neutral, forced her body to stay still. She heard Helen shift beside her, ready to intervene if Emma showed any sign of what Malcolm would later call an episode. Thomas watched this unfold from his position by the service station. He'd cleaned up after enough of these events to recognize performance, and Malcolm Drake was giving the show of his life. But it was Emma who held Thomas's attention, the micro-tensions in her shoulders, the way her breathing had gone shallow and controlled. He knew that posture. It was the same way Maeve held herself when the kids at school mentioned her missing mother, trying to be brave and small at the same time. The orchestra began tuning for the next waltz, and Malcolm raised his champagne glass. To Catherine's memory, he declared, and to Emma's courage in facing each day despite her challenges. The room echoed the toast, hundreds of glasses raised toward a woman who couldn't see them. Emma stood frozen as the waltz began, the familiar rhythm making her stomach turn. It was Strauss Tales from the Vienna Woods, the same waltz that had been playing on the radio that night, the last thing she'd heard before the world went dark. That's when Thomas made his decision. He didn't overthink it, didn't consider the consequences. He simply set down his mop, walked across the ballroom floor in his work boots that squeaked against the polish, and stopped directly in front of Emma Drake. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, his voice cutting through the orchestral swell. The room seemed to inhale collectively. Helen started forward, but Emma's hand rose slightly, stopping her. "I'm sorry?" Emma's voice was careful, cultured, but Thomas heard something else underneath a flicker of genuine surprise. "I asked if you'd like to dance," Thomas repeated, keeping his voice steady and warm. "Fair warning, I learned from YouTube videos, so your feet might be in mortal peril." A ghost of something not quite a smile crossed Emma's face. Around them, the crowd buzzed with shock. The janitor approaching Malcolm Drake's daughter, the untouchable ghost of every gala, the tragic figure meant to be observed but never engaged. "I don't dance," Emma said automatically, the response she'd been trained to give. "Neither do I, really," Thomas admitted. "But the music's playing, and standing still seems like a waste of a good waltz." Malcolm started forward from across the room, his face darkening, but Emma did something she hadn't done in 10 years. She extended her hand. "All right," she said softly. "But if I step on your feet, you asked for it." Thomas took her hand gently, noting how cold her fingers were, how they trembled slightly before firming in his grip. "Fair enough. Should we figure this out together?" He guided her hand to his shoulder, placed his own at her waist with careful respect. The crowd parted around them, creating a circle of shock and speculation. Malcolm had stopped his approach, trapped by his own narrative. How could he publicly reject someone, showing kindness to his brave, suffering daughter, without destroying his carefully maintained image? "The basic box step," Thomas murmured close to Emma's ear, quiet enough that only she could hear. "Forward with your right foot when I step back with my left. Just follow the pressure of my hand." They began to move, awkwardly at first. Emma's body was rigid with years of trained stillness, but Thomas was patient, his movements clear and deliberate. 1, 2, 3, he counted softly. 1, 2, 3. The room watched in stunned silence as the janitor and the blind heiress found their rhythm. Emma's expression began to soften, her body remembering something it had known before that night, before the crash, before the darkness. She'd been in ballet once, before everything changed. Her muscles knew how to follow, how to trust. "You're a natural," Thomas said, and there was no pity in his voice, no careful condescension. He spoke to her like she was just a woman at a dance, not a symbol or a tragedy or a prop. That's when it happened. The waltz swirled around them, and suddenly Emma was 16 again. But not in the way her father's story claimed. The memory rushed back with violent clarity, not grabbed in anger but in terror, her hands reaching for the wheel as Malcolm, drunk and raging about her mother's request for divorce, had yanked it hard to the right. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, hear her mother's scream, feel the car leaving the road. "It wasn't me," she whispered, the words falling from her lips like stones. "Oh God, it wasn't me." Thomas felt her stumble, caught her smoothly, kept them moving. "What wasn't you?" he asked quietly. Emma's unseeing eyes filled with tears. For 10 years she'd believed the story. The trauma, the head injury, the darkness, they'd all conspired to bury the truth. But the waltz, the exact waltz, with someone holding her like she was precious instead of poisonous, it had unlocked what Malcolm had spent a decade ensuring stayed buried. "The crash," she breathed. "I didn't grab the wheel. He did. My father, he yanked it. He was drunk, angry about the divorce papers. I tried to stop him, but..." The words came faster now, tumbling over each other. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, some pulled by morbid curiosity, others by the magnetic pull of witnessing something real at an event built on artifice. Malcolm's face had gone white, then red. He strode toward them with violent purpose. "Emma's having an episode," he announced loudly, his voice carrying that note of practiced concern. "The dancing, the memories, it's too much for her. Helen, Helen materialized beside them, her hands reaching for Emma's arm, but Thomas didn't let go. "She seems fine to me," he said evenly. "You don't understand her condition," Malcolm said, his voice dropping to a threatening register that the crowd couldn't hear. "She has delusions. The trauma." "I remember," Emma said louder, her voice cracking but determined. "I remember everything. The whiskey on your breath. Mom begging you to pull over. You yanking the wheel. Security," Malcolm barked, and two men in dark suits materialized. "My daughter needs medical attention. Now." They pulled Emma from Thomas's arms with professional efficiency. She didn't fight she'd learned years ago, that fighting only made things worse, only fed into the narrative of instability. But as they guided her past Thomas, she pressed close enough to whisper urgently in his ear, "There's proof. A video on my phone from that night. It's in the cloud, but I can't remember the password. Please." Then they were dragging her away, Helen following with a syringe already in hand, and Malcolm was there, gripping Thomas's shoulder with crushing force. "You're done here," Malcolm said quietly. "Done in this building, done in this city if you ever speak to my daughter again. Security will escort you out." Thomas looked at the hand on his shoulder, then up at Malcolm's face. He saw it there, not the grieving widower, not the devoted father, but something cold and calculating, something that would destroy anything that threatened its control. "I heard her," Thomas said simply. Malcolm's grip tightened. "No, you didn't. You heard a sick girl having delusions. That's what everyone heard. And if you suggest otherwise, if you go near her again, I'll destroy you. You have a daughter, don't you? Maeve? Sweet girl. Be a shame if Child Services got an anonymous tip about a single father leaving her alone at night while he works." The threat landed like ice in Thomas's veins, but he kept his face neutral. Security arrived, flanking him, and Thomas allowed himself to be escorted out. But as they rode the service elevator down, his mind was already working. Emma Drake had asked for help. And Thomas Kellen, who'd failed to save his wife but swore he'd never fail anyone else who needed him, was going to deliver it. Outside, rain had begun to fall, turning the city lights into watercolor smears. Thomas stood under the service entrance awning, pulled out his phone, and called Mrs. Chen. "I might be late tonight," he said when she answered. "Is it okay if Mava stays over?" "Of course," Mrs. Chen replied warmly. "She's already asleep on the couch with Frederick." Frederick was Mrs. Chen's ancient tabby cat who had adopted Maeve as his favorite human. Rough night at work? "Something like that," Thomas said, looking up at the Drake Tower rising into the rain-dark sky 6 blocks away. "But I've got something I need to take care of." By the time Thomas reached Drake Tower, the rain had intensified into a steady downpour that turned the streets into rivers of reflected neon. He'd gone home first, changing out of his work uniform into dark jeans and a jacket, gathering the few things he'd need: a small flashlight, his work ID from when he'd cleaned the tower 6 months ago — they never bothered to deactivate service access — and a pen drive, though he wasn't sure yet what he'd need it for. The tower stood like a glass and steel monument to Malcolm Drake's empire, 40 stories of corporate power that never quite went dark. Thomas knew the building's rhythms he'd cleaned here during the contract overlap between his company and the new service they'd hired. He knew that security did their rounds every 2 hours after midnight, that the executive floors required special elevator codes that changed weekly, but that the service elevators ran on the old system that nobody had bothered to update. He entered through the loading dock, his old keycard still working on the rusty reader. The basement smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and garbage, waiting for morning pickup. Thomas made his way to the service elevator, riding it up to the 32nd floor where he'd have to switch to reach the executive levels. The elevator hummed and rattled, a stark contrast to the smooth silence of the public lifts. The 32nd floor housed accounting, dark now except for the emergency lighting that traced paths between the cubicles. Thomas moved quickly but carefully, aware that security cameras covered the main hallways but not the interior office spaces. He'd learned their blind spots during countless night shifts, never imagining he'd use that knowledge for something like this. Emma had said there was a video in the cloud, but she couldn't remember the password. That meant she'd had a phone that night, had somehow been recording. But where would a 16-year-old Emma have kept her passwords? And more importantly, where would Malcolm have preserved evidence of his daughter's life before the accident? The executive elevator required a code, but Thomas had noticed something during his time cleaning here. Malcolm Drake was predictable in his narcissism. The code was always some variation of important dates in his official narrative. Thomas tried the date of Drake Industries' IPO. Nothing. The date of Malcolm's first Fortune 500 listing. The elevator chimed softly and began to rise. The executive floor was different from the rest of the building: wood paneling instead of glass, thick carpet that absorbed sound, artwork that cost more than Thomas would make in a lifetime. Malcolm's office occupied the corner, but Thomas wasn't interested in that. He was looking for something else, something he'd noticed once when delivering supplies after hours. A door marked private halfway down the east corridor. The door was locked, but the lock was electronic, tied to the same system as the elevators. The IPO date worked again. Inside, Thomas found himself in what could only be described as a shrine. It was Emma's teenage bedroom, preserved exactly as it must have been the night of the crash. Posters of bands from 2014 covered one wall: Imagine Dragons, Lord, One Direction. A laptop sat closed on a desk next to homework assignments, dated April 14th, the day before everything changed. School uniforms hung in the open closet, and on the bedside table, a diary with a small lock, the key still in it. Thomas felt like an intruder in a mausoleum, but he pressed forward. He opened the diary carefully, finding the last entry dated the morning of April 15th. Mom showed me the divorce papers last night. She's finally doing it. Dad's going to lose it when he finds out. She says we're going to stay with Aunt Sarah for a while. I'm scared but also relieved. Maybe we can finally stop pretending everything's perfect. Maybe we can finally breathe. Asterisk. Below that, in different ink, like she'd come back to add it. Asterisk password for everything. Starlight. Mom's nickname for me. So I'll never forget. Asterisk. Starlight. Thomas photographed the page with his phone, then carefully returned everything to its exact position. He was halfway to the door when he heard the elevator chime. Security was early. He slipped out of the room, pulling the door closed silently behind him. Footsteps approached from the main corridor, heavy, unhurried. A flashlight beam swept the walls. Thomas pressed himself against a recessed doorway, controlling his breathing. Checking floor 40, a voice said into a radio. All clear so far. The guard passed within 3 feet of Thomas, the flashlight beam missing him by inches. Thomas waited until the footsteps receded toward Malcolm's office, then moved quickly but silently to the stairwell. He couldn't risk the elevator now. He descended 10 floors before his phone buzzed. Maeve, texting from Mrs. Chen's phone. Asterisk, Dad. Frederick threw up on Mrs. Chen's sofa. She says it's fine, but she looks sad. When are you coming? Asterisk. Thomas smiled despite everything. His daughter had a way of cutting through any situation with her 8-year-old clarity. He texted back. Asterisk, soon, sweetheart. Tell Mrs. Chen I'll pay for cleaning. Give Frederick a gentle pet from me. Asterisk. Asterisk. He doesn't deserve it. He ate her spider plant. Asterisk. Then, after a pause, asterisk. Are you okay? You sound weird in texts. Asterisk. How did she always know? Asterisk. I'm helping someone. I'll explain tomorrow. Asterisk. Asterisk. Is it someone who needs help? Asterisk. Asterisk. Yes. Asterisk. Then it's okay. Mom would say that's what we do. Asterisk. Thomas had to stop on the stairwell landing, overwhelmed by his daughter's simple faith. Amanda would have said exactly that. She would have marched right up to Drake Tower and demanded justice for Emma. The thought gave him strength to continue. By the time he reached the parking garage, dawn was breaking over Lake Michigan, turning the sky a pale gray pink. Thomas sat in his decade-old Honda, looking at the photo of the diary entry. Starlight, but knowing the password was only part of the problem. How could he get this information to Emma when she was kept under constant surveillance? Then he remembered. The Drakes ordered flowers every week from Rosewood Florists for their penthouse. He knew because he'd once had to sign for a delivery when he'd worked the Drake Tower contract. And Rosewood Florists was 3 blocks from Maeve's school. They did custom cards. And more importantly, they offered Braille transcription for their vision-impaired customers. He'd seen the sign in their window. Thomas drove home as the city woke around him, formulating a plan. It would take timing, luck, and a little help from an 8-year-old with her mother's brave heart. When he picked up Maeve from Mrs. Chen's apartment, she was wearing her school uniform, but had added her own touch mismatched socks, one with stripes, one with polka dots. Fashion statement, Thomas asked. Protest, Maeve replied seriously. Mrs. Peterson says we have to wear matching socks, but the handbook doesn't actually say that. I checked. Thomas hugged her tightly. Your mom would be proud. So who were you helping? Maeve asked as they walked to the car. Thomas considered how much to tell her. A woman who's in trouble, her father, hurt her, and now he won't let her tell anyone the truth. Maeve was quiet for a moment. Like Entangled, where Mother Gothel keeps Rapunzel in the tower and lies to her? Very much like that, actually. Then we have to help her, Maeve said simply. That's what good people do. At Rosewood Florists, Thomas ordered a bouquet of stargazer lilies he'd looked up their meaning the night before. Rebirth, renewal, and most importantly, sympathy for loss. Something Helen wouldn't question if she inspected them. I need a card in Braille, he told the florist, an elderly woman with kind eyes. Just one word, Starlight. She didn't question it, simply nodded and prepared the special card with the raised dots that spelled out Emma's password. Thomas had the flowers sent to the Drake penthouse with the morning delivery. What he didn't know was that Emma had been sedated for 12 hours after the gala, waking fuzzy and disoriented to Helen's concerned clucking, and her father's steady voice explaining that she'd had another episode, that she'd frightened everyone with her delusions. That janitor took advantage of your condition, Malcolm said, sitting beside her bed in their penthouse prison. He's been dealt with. You won't be bothered again. Emma didn't respond. She'd learned that silence was safer, that arguing only led to stronger medications, longer periods of foggy unconsciousness. But inside, the memory burned bright and clear. She knew what was real. The waltz had unlocked it, and no amount of gaslighting could lock it away again. When the flowers arrived that afternoon, Helen brought them to Emma's room with her usual cheerful commentary. Stargazers today. Your father knows they're your favorite. Emma's fingers found the bouquet, traced the petals with practiced delicacy. Her fingertips brushed the card, felt the familiar raised dots of Braille. It had been years since anyone had sent her something she could read herself. Her fingers moved over the dots slowly, spelling out the word Starlight. Emma's breath caught. The password. The janitor Thomas. His name was Thomas, he'd found it. But how? And more importantly, what could she do with it when she couldn't access a phone or computer without Helen's supervision? She kept her expression neutral, aware that Helen was watching. They smell beautiful, she said simply. But inside, hope flickered for the first time in a decade. 3 days passed before Emma got her chance. Malcolm had scheduled another public appearance, this time at a charity garden party in Millennium Park. These events were carefully orchestrated. Emma would be visible enough to maintain the narrative, but controlled enough to prevent any episodes. What Malcolm didn't know was that Thomas had spent those 3 days planning with the precision of someone who'd had to figure out how to stretch $1 and make miracles out of overtime pay. He'd researched the event, studied the layout of the garden venue, and most importantly, he'd made a decision that Amanda would have been proud of. He was going to trust Maeve. The garden party sprawled across the Lurie Garden, 500 of Chicago's elite mingling among the prairie grasses and wildflowers. Emma sat on a bench near the fountain, Helen beside her, while Malcolm worked the crowd. The afternoon sun was warm on Emma's face, and she could smell the salvias and wild onions, hear the splash of water and the hum of conversations she wasn't part of. Thomas and Maeve entered through the public access point. The garden was city property, open to everyone, though the charity had roped off sections for their donors. Maeve wore her best dress, the one Amanda had bought for her before she got sick, and carried a small purse that Thomas had checked 3 times to make sure contained exactly what they needed. Remember, Thomas whispered, you're just a kid who loves flowers. If anyone asks, we're not together. I know, Dad, Maeve whispered back. I'm not a baby. They separated, Thomas moving toward the volunteer table to legitimately sign up for cleanup duty. It would give him a reason to be there, to linger. Maeve wandered through the garden with the studied casualness of an 8-year-old on a mission, stopping to smell flowers, to watch a butterfly, to work her way gradually toward the bench where Emma Saturday. Emma heard the child approaching light footsteps, a small voice humming something that might have been Taylor Swift. Children were often brought near her at these events, their parents using proximity to teach lessons about gratitude or caution. She prepared her practiced smile. But then the child bumped into her, hard enough to knock Emma's purse from her lap. Oh no, the young voice said, genuinely distressed. I'm so sorry. I was watching a bee and not looking where I was going. Helen immediately intervened, but Maeve was already on the ground, gathering the spilled contents. I'll get everything. I'm really sorry. It's all right, Emma said, hearing something in the child's voice, not pity or fear, but genuine concern. Bees are very interesting. This one was huge, Maeve said, and as she placed items back in Emma's purse, she slipped something else in a small flip phone, already powered on, already set to accessibility mode. There, I think that's everything. I'm really sorry, ma'am. Thank you for helping, Emma said carefully, her fingers briefly brushing the child's hand, feeling the slight tremor of nervousness there. This wasn't just any child. Maeve stood up, brushing off her dress. My mom always said if you make a mess, you clean it up, she said, and there was something pointed in the words, something meant for Emma to understand. Then she was gone, skipping away toward the prairie grass section. Helen checked Emma's purse briefly, but was distracted by Malcolm approaching with a group of board members. Emma, the Richardsons want to say hello. Emma endured the parade of condolences and praise for her bravery, all while intensely aware of the phone's weight in her purse. When Malcolm finally declared it was time to leave, Emma was getting tired. He could tell she asked to use the restroom. I'll come with you, Helen said automatically. I can manage, Emma said, allowing a note of irritation to creep into her voice. I'm not a child. Malcolm, aware of the watching crowd, intervened. Let her have a moment of privacy, Helen. The family restroom is single occupancy. She'll be fine. Emma navigated to the restroom with her cane, her heart pounding. Inside, she locked the door and pulled out the phone. It was already in accessibility mode, voiceover activated. She pressed the home button. Phone, messages, phone. Safari, the robotic voice said as she swiped through apps. She found Safari, double-tapped. The browser was already open to a Gmail login page. She carefully typed EmmaDrake 2014, her old email address from when she was 16. Then, with shaking fingers, Starlight. Welcome to Gmail, the voiceover announced. Inbox, 23,412 unread messages. 10 years of emails she'd never seen, but she wasn't looking for those. She navigated to Google Photos, to the cloud backup from her old phone, and there it was, in a folder dated the 15th of April 2014. She double-tapped on the video file. It began to play, and even though the screen was black to her eyes, she could hear everything through the phone's speaker, turned low. Her own voice, younger, laughing. Dad, you're going too fast. Mom, tell him to slow down. Her mother's voice, the one she'd almost forgotten the exact sound of. Malcolm, please. You've had too much to drink. Let me drive. I'm fine. Malcolm's voice slurred, angry. Don't tell me what to do, Catherine. Not after what you pulled today. The divorce papers? Malcolm, we discussed. You discussed. You decided. You're taking my daughter and leaving? Really? Mom, look out. Her 16-year-old self screaming. The sound of tires squealing, Malcolm yelling, You want to leave? Fine. The sickening sound of the wheel being yanked, her mother screaming, her own voice crying out, Dad, no. Then impact. Glass shattering, metal crunching, silence. Emma sat on the bathroom floor, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of validation, of fury, of a truth finally confirmed. She navigated carefully, found the forward option, typed in an email address she'd memorized from a business card pressed into her hand at last year's gala by a journalist who'd whispered, If you ever want to tell your real story. But before she could hit send, the door handle rattled. Emma? Helen's voice, concerned. You've been in there for 15 minutes. Your father is worried. Emma quickly closed the apps, turned off the phone, slipped it into the inner pocket of her jacket where Helen never checked. I'm coming, she called, standing and flushing the toilet for show. She ran the water, dried her face, and opened the door. Helen's face was suspicious, but Emma had learned to keep her expression blank, had perfected it over 10 years. They returned to Malcolm, who was saying his goodbyes, eager to leave now that he'd been seen and admired sufficiently. As they walked to the car, Emma heard a man's voice among the cleanup volunteers, directing others where to stack chairs. Thomas, he was still here, making sure she'd had time. That night, Emma lay awake in her bed, the phone hidden under her pillow, and made a decision. She could send the video to the journalist, but that would only destroy Malcolm. It wouldn't free her. He'd find a way to spin it, to claim the video was edited, that she was confused, unstable. She needed to do something bigger, something undeniable. She needed witnesses, the kind Malcolm couldn't buy or intimidate. The quarterly board meeting was in 5 days. All of Drake Industries' board members, several major shareholders, and the CFO would be in one room. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m., but Emma knew Malcolm always arrived early to set up his presentations, to control the room before anyone else arrived. She typed carefully on the phone, using muscle memory more than voiceover to navigate. She sent the video to 20 board members' email addresses. She'd memorized them over years of hearing Helen read Malcolm's correspondence aloud. But she scheduled the send for 3:47 p.m. on the day of the meeting. If her plan worked, by then it would be too late for Malcolm to stop it. Then she wrote one more email, this one to Thomas's work email that she'd found on the cleaning company's website. Thank you for the flowers. The board meeting is Thursday at 3 p.m. Drake Industries, 40th floor. If something happens to me, make sure the truth comes out. E. She didn't know if he'd receive it, if he'd understand, if he'd come. But she had to believe that someone would witness what she was about to do. Thursday arrived with unusual spring warmth, the kind that made the whole city feel restless. Emma had been careful all week, playing the perfect damaged daughter, taking her medications without protest, letting Helen dress her in the pale pink outfit Malcolm had chosen for her appearance at the board meeting. She was to be presented briefly, a reminder of Malcolm's personal struggles and triumphs. Thomas had received the email and spent the intervening days wrestling with what to do. He couldn't get into the Drake Industries boardroom. Security would stop him immediately. But he could get into the building. His friend Marcus worked security at the lobby desk and owed him a favor from when Thomas had covered for him during his mother's illness. I just need 10 minutes, Thomas told Marcus that morning. I need to deliver something to the 40th floor. Marcus looked uncomfortable. That's executive level. I can't. It's about Emma Drake, Thomas said quietly. She needs help, Marcus. The real kind. Marcus had a daughter too. He sighed, checked the schedule. There's a fire drill scheduled for 3:50, building wide. If you happen to be in the stairwell then, and if the executives happen to be evacuating, and if you happen to get swept up with them. Thomas gripped his friend's shoulder. Thank you. At 2:45, Emma and Helen arrived at Drake Industries. The building hummed with its usual energy phones ringing, elevators chiming, the particular sound of commerce and power. They rode up to the 40th floor, where Malcolm was already in the boardroom, his laptop connected to the presentation screen, his materials perfectly arranged. There's my girl, he said when Emma entered, his public voice, the one that suggested warmth without containing any. You look perfect. Now remember, you'll sit quietly in the corner during the presentation. When I introduce you, you stand, you smile, you wave. That's all. Yes, Father, Emma said, the words ash in her mouth. Board members began arriving at 2:55, filling the room with expensive cologne and small talk. Emma sat in her designated chair, hands folded, the phone a secret weight in her pocket. She'd set it to silent, but she could feel it there, counting down to 3:47. At 3 sharp, Malcolm called the meeting to order. Emma listened to quarterly reports, to projections and acquisitions, to the language of money and power that had been the soundtrack to her imprisonment. She waited. At 3:35, Malcolm began his CEO presentation. His voice filled the room, confident and commanding, selling his vision of Drake Industries' future. Emma's fingers found the phone in her pocket. She'd practiced this, using voiceover with the volume off, navigating by touch and memory alone. At 3:42, she stood up. Emma? Malcolm paused, irritation flickering across his features. Please sit down. I have something to say, Emma said, her voice carrying surprisingly well in the boardroom designed for acoustics. She's having an episode, Malcolm said quickly to the board. Helen? But Emma was already moving, her cane finding the path she'd memorized, moving toward the presentation system at the center of the room. 10 years ago, my father killed my mother and let me take the blame. The room erupted. Board members shifted uncomfortably, some standing, others looking to Malcolm for explanation. Security was already moving, but Emma had reached the presentation podium. Her fingers found the auxiliary cable, the one she'd confirmed would be there during dozens of previous board meetings. "Emma, stop this," Malcolm commanded. But there was something new in his voice, fear. Emma connected the phone to the auxiliary port. She'd already navigated to the video, had it ready. She pressed play. Her 16-year-old voice filled the boardroom, laughing about her father's speed. Then Catherine's voice, concerned, asking to drive. Malcolm's slurred refusal. The argument about divorce. Malcolm lunged toward her, but Thomas, who'd been swept into the evacuating crowd when the fire alarm went off at 3:50, as Marcus had promised, was already moving. He'd entered with the confused executives returning from the false alarm and positioned himself between Malcolm and Emma. "Don't touch her," Thomas said quietly. On the speakers, Malcolm's recorded voice was raging. "You want to leave? Fine." The sound of the wheel being yanked. The screams. The crash. The boardroom was frozen. 20 of Chicago's most powerful people stood in absolute silence as the recording played out the sound of young Emma crying, calling for her mother. Malcolm's voice in the background not calling 911 but muttering, "This is your fault, Emma. You grabbed the wheel. That's what happened. You grabbed the wheel." When it ended, the silence was deafening. Emma stood perfectly still, tears running down her face. "I believed him," she said to the room. "For 10 years I believed I killed her. But the waltz, hearing that waltz, it brought it back. And this man," she gestured toward Thomas, "though she couldn't see him, he believed me when no one else would." Malcolm's face had gone from red to white. That's edited. "She's delusional. She's—" "Malcolm." The board chairman, Robert Ashford, stood slowly. "That's your voice. We all know your voice." "She's sick," Malcolm shouted. "She's been unstable since the accident." "The accident you caused?" asked another board member. Malcolm looked around the room wildly, seeing his empire crumbling. "You can't believe her over me. I built this company. You killed Catherine," Robert said quietly. "And you've been using your disabled daughter as a prop to maintain your image while keeping her prisoner." "Helen," Malcolm barked, "tell them about her condition." But Helen had stepped back, her face pale. I was hired to manage her medications, to keep her calm." He said it was for her own good. The board members were pulling out phones, some calling lawyers, others calling news desks. Someone had already dialed 911. Malcolm made one last desperate lunge toward Emma. Whether to hurt her or grab the phone, no one would ever know. Thomas caught him, didn't strike him, just held him immobile until security, the real security, not Malcolm's personal team, arrived. "Mr. Drake," Robert Ashford said formally, "the board is calling an emergency vote. All in favor of immediately removing Malcolm Drake as CEO?" Every hand rose. "Furthermore, we're recommending the district attorney investigate both the death of Catherine Drake and the false imprisonment and medical abuse of Emma Drake." Police arrived within minutes. Someone had made sure to mention Malcolm Drake's name, ensuring a quick response. As they led Malcolm away, he turned back to Emma one last time. "You've destroyed everything," he snarled. "No," Emma said quietly. "You did that 10 years ago." After Malcolm was taken away and the board members had given their statements, after the police had gently interviewed Emma with victim services present, after the news vans had begun gathering outside, Thomas found Emma sitting in Malcolm's office. Someone had thought it fitting irony to let her rest there. "Thank you," she said when she heard his footsteps. She'd learned his walk by then, solid, unhurried, safe. "You didn't need me," Thomas said. "You had the video. You had the truth." "I needed someone to believe me first," Emma corrected. "You gave me that. You and—" She paused. "The girl who bumped into me. That was your daughter, wasn't it?" Thomas smiled. "Maeve. She's 8. She said you needed help, and helping people is what good people do. Your wife raised her well." "She did," Thomas agreed. "Before we lost her." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside, they could hear the city 40 floors below, continuing on as if the world hadn't just shifted. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked. Emma considered. "Learn to live, I suppose, without the medications, without the handlers, without the cage. It's terrifying." "You don't have to do it alone," Thomas said carefully. "Maeve and we're good at figuring things out, if you need friends." Emma smiled, a real smile this time. "I'd like that." 6 months later, Millennium Park was dressed in early October gold, the trees showing off their autumn finest. Emma walked without a cane now. She'd been practicing with an orientation and mobility specialist, relearning confidence that had been medicated away. She still moved carefully, but there was freedom in her steps. The dedication ceremony for the Catherine Drake Foundation for Road Safety and Victim Advocacy was small. Emma had insisted on that. No galas, no spectacle. Just people who genuinely cared about the cause. Thomas and Maeve sat in the front row, Maeve wearing her special occasion dress, the same one from the garden party, now a bit short on her growing frame, with her signature mismatched socks. She'd appointed herself Emma's unofficial audio describer for movies and her official consultant on which ice cream flavors were worth trying. "The plaque is really shiny," Maeve whispered to Emma as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "Your mom's name looks like it's written in sunshine." Emma squeezed the girl's hand. "That's exactly how I picture it." Malcolm was awaiting trial, his assets frozen, his reputation destroyed. The board had voted to settle with Emma for an undisclosed sum that would fund the foundation for decades. Helen had testified for the prosecution in exchange for immunity, detailing years of forced medication and psychological manipulation. But Emma tried not to think about that today. Today was about her mother, about truth, about the strange family she'd found in a janitor who'd asked her to dance, and his daughter who'd been brave enough to bump into a stranger. Thomas had been offered a position at Drake Industries. The board felt it was the least they could do, but he'd turned it down. "I like being a janitor," he'd said. "It's honest work. Plus, someone needs to keep teaching. Maeve that there's dignity in every job." Instead, he'd accepted Emma's offer to be the foundation's facilities manager, which mostly meant he made sure their small office was accessible and safe, and that Emma always had fresh flowers on her desk, though never stargazer lilies. Those carried too much weight. As the ceremony concluded, and people mingled in the garden, Emma heard Maeve trying to teach Thomas how to identify birds by their songs. "That's clearly a cardinal, Dad. They all sound like birds to me, kiddo." "You're hopeless. Emma, tell him about the difference between cardinal and robin songs." Emma joined them on the bench, the October sun warm on her face. "Your dad's not hopeless. He just hears different things than we do." "Like what?" Maeve asked. Thomas considered. "Like when someone needs help, or when they're pretending to be okay when they're not, or when they need someone to believe in them." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, clean tears. "Yes," she said. "Exactly like that." As the afternoon wore on and Maeve chased pigeons, while Thomas and Emma talked about the Foundation's first initiative, a program providing free legal aid to accident victims, Emma realized something. For 10 years, she'd been blind in more ways than one. Not just to the truth about that night, but to the possibility that life could exist beyond guilt, beyond control, beyond the story someone else had written for her. She still couldn't see the sunset painting the Chicago skyline pink and gold. She couldn't see Thomas's kind eyes or Maeve's wild hair escaping from her braids. But she could hear Maeve's laughter echoing across the garden, could feel Thomas's steady presence beside her, could smell the last roses of summer mixing with the first hints of autumn fires. And for the first time since she was 16 years old, Emma Drake could see her future. Asterisk. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that truth always finds its way to light, even through the darkest deceptions. What moments in your life required someone to believe in you when no one else would? Let me know in the comments below, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply show up for each other. Asterisk. The graduation ceremony had already begun when Ben Walker arrived, his worn green military jacket drawing stares from parents in designer suits. Security guards moved to intercept him at the gate, their hands raised in practiced authority. "Sir, the ceremony's full. No late entries." Ben nodded, understanding their job, and quietly showed his invitation. The guard squinted at the crumpled paper, then at Ben's weathered face, clearly doubting this man belonged among Whitmore Academy's elite families. "You'll need to sit in the back," the guard finally said. Ben Walker, former Navy SEAL commander, simply replied, "That's fine." As he walked toward the last row, no one knew that 6 of America's most decorated warriors were already on their way. The morning sun cast long shadows across Whitmore Academy's manicured courtyard, where 400 chairs sat arranged in perfect symmetry, white fabric fluttering in the June breeze. Parents had arrived early, claiming prime spots with designer handbags and folded programs, their conversations a symphony of stock portfolios and summer homes in the Hamptons. The stage gleamed with fresh polish, adorned with arrangements of white roses and blue hydrangeas that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Behind the podium, a row of mahogany chairs awaited the distinguished guests, board members, donors whose names graced buildings, the mayor's representative. Everything about this space whispered exclusivity, tradition, power accumulated across generations. Ben Walker had parked his 15-year-old pickup truck 3 blocks away, not wanting its rust and primer patches to stand out among the Mercedes and Teslas. He'd worn his best clothes, khaki pants pressed with military precision, a white shirt he'd ironed twice, and the jacket, always the jacket. The green fabric had faded over 20 years, its edges frayed, one button replaced with another that didn't quite match. But the SEAL trident on the chest pocket remained sharp, the patch, reading SEAL Team 11, Commander B. Walker, still intact, despite countless washings. He'd found the invitation on his apartment door 3 days ago, slipped under in an envelope with his son's handwriting. Inside, alongside the formal graduation announcement, Tyler had written a single line, "I know you'll be there, Dad. You always are." The letter had weight beyond its paper. Tyler had included his guardianship papers, signed when Ben had taken custody after his wife's death 18 years ago. The boy had been hours old, red-faced and screaming in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and grief. The doctors had given Ben options: adoption agencies, foster care, relatives who might be better suited. But Ben had looked at that tiny life, so fragile and fierce, and made the only choice a father could make. He'd left the SEALs 6 months later, trading night raids and classified missions for night feedings and diaper changes, trading brothers in arms for parent-teacher conferences where he sat alone, trading medals for minimum wage jobs that let him be home when Tyler got off school. Now, walking past rows of parents who pulled their purses closer as he passed, Ben kept his eyes forward. A woman in pearls whispered to her husband, "Security really should screen better. Look at that jacket." Her companion, a man whose Rolex caught the light with every gesture, responded just loudly enough to be heard, probably one of the custodial staff. They sometimes let them watch. Ben had heard worse in countries where bullets answered insults. He found a seat in the very last row, metal folding chairs that hadn't been covered in white fabric like the others. The view was partially blocked by a decorative arch of balloons, but he could see the stage. That was enough. 3 rows ahead, Walt Greer shifted in his seat. 71 years old, Vietnam veteran, Purple Heart recipient. He'd learned to read men the way others read books. Something about the newcomer's walk, controlled, balanced, weight distributed for instant movement, sparked recognition. Walt had seen that walk before, in men who'd been trained to move through darkness and emerge victorious. He turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the patch. His breath caught. SEAL Team 11. He knew that unit. Everyone in special operations circles knew that unit. They'd been legends in Afghanistan, their commander known for bringing every man home alive through 7 deployments. Walt squinted, trying to match the weathered face with memories of newspaper photos from a decade ago. Could it really be him? The ceremony proceeded with practiced precision. Principal Dana Wilcox, immaculate in her navy suit, welcomed the crowd with rehearsed warmth. The valedictorian would speak third, after the salutatorian and class president. Tyler Walker's name appeared in the program, with a small asterisk: full scholarship to MIT, highest GPA in Whitmore Academy's 70-year history, National Merit Scholar. The accomplishment seemed at odds with the man in the back row, yet Tyler had listed his father as his sole guardian on every form, every emergency contact, every proud moment documented in the school's records. A camera crew from the local news station began setting up, their equipment blocking several sightlines. The producer, a young woman with a clipboard and headset, scanned the crowd for optimal angles. She noticed Ben immediately. His jacket stood out like camouflage in a ballroom. "Excuse me, sir," she said, approaching with professional firmness. "We need this area clear for the camera track. You'll need to move." Ben stood without argument, gathering himself to shift further back, though there were no more rows. "Perhaps you could stand by the fence?" she suggested, pointing to the periphery where maintenance staff sometimes watched events. Ben nodded, moving to the indicated spot. He'd stood watch in worse places. Dan Shepard, a father of 3 seated in the middle section, had observed the interaction. Something about the quiet dignity of the man's compliance struck him. As Ben passed, Dan noticed the patch more clearly, saw the wear patterns on the jacket that spoke of constant use rather than neglect. On impulse, Dan stood and extended his hand. Dan Shepard. "My daughter's graduating today." Ben accepted the handshake, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Ben Walker. Same here. Son." Dan's eyes widened slightly at the name. Walker. The valedictorian was Tyler Walker. This man, relegated to the fence, was the father of their class's brightest star. "Would you like my seat?" Dan offered quietly. Ben shook his head. I'm good where I am. Just want to see him walk. Dan returned to his seat, but something had shifted in his perception. He began watching not just the stage, but the man by the fence. The first two speakers delivered their prepared remarks, celebrations of achievement, thanks to parents and teachers, jokes about senior pranks that drew polite laughter. Tyler Walker rose for his turn, and Ben straightened against the fence. His son looked older than 18, shoulders broad from swimming, posture straight as a marble column. Tyler approached the podium, set down his prepared cards, and then did something unexpected. He pushed them aside. His eyes swept the crowd, searching, until they found the figure by the fence. For a moment, father and son held each other's gaze across the distance. Then Tyler began to speak. I had a speech prepared about the future, about dreams and ambitions, about the doors that education opens. But standing here, I realize there's something more important I need to say. It's about the doors that close so others can open. It's about sacrifice that goes unnoticed and love that never announces itself. Tyler's voice carried clear and strong, trained by years of debate team, but now trembling with emotion. My father is here today. He's standing by the fence because he arrived late, because he didn't want to make a fuss, because that's who he is. He stands at the edges so I can stand at the center. Heads began to turn, seeking the subject of Tyler's words. Ben remained still, his jaw tight, eyes locked on his son. Tyler continued, 18 years ago, my father was Commander Benjamin Walker, SEAL Team 11. He'd led 68 combat missions, earned 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart he never talks about. He had a career that admirals envied, and a future that promised stars on his shoulders. Then my mother died giving birth to me, and he had a choice. The Navy offered him another deployment, another chance at glory. Instead, he took off his trident and picked up a baby bottle. The crowd had gone silent now, even the young children sensing the weight of the moment. Principal Wilcox gripped her program, watching her carefully orchestrated ceremony veer off script. Tyler's voice grew stronger. My father has worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat: warehouse shifts, security details, anything that paid. He wore the same jacket to every school event, the one he's wearing now, because he spent his clothing money on my textbooks. Some of you have whispered about that jacket today, called it worn, called it inappropriate. That jacket has been to places where America's freedom was defended in darkness. That jacket has caught the tears of dying brothers and the rain of foreign storms. It isn't worn, it's seasoned. Marissa Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Holdings, and the Academy's most influential board member, watched from her place of honor on the stage. She prided herself on control, on image, on the careful cultivation of success. This deviation from protocol irritated her. Graduation was about collective achievement, not individual stories. She made a note to speak with Principal Wilcox about screening speeches more carefully. Yet something nagged at her. The name Benjamin Walker felt familiar, like an echo from a distant conversation. She pushed the thought aside, focusing on when would be appropriate to intervene. I stand here as valedictorian, not because I'm the smartest, Tyler continued, but because I had a father who sat with me through every homework struggle, who checked my math even when he'd been up since 4 a.m., who told me that excellence wasn't about being better than others but about being better than yourself were yesterday. He never missed a parent-teacher conference, even when it meant losing a day's wages. He never missed a science fair, even when he had to stand in the back because single fathers in worn jackets don't get seats in the front row. Walt Greer was already pulling out his phone, typing quickly into a veterans group chat. Benjamin Walker is at Whitmore Academy. The Benjamin Walker. Someone needs to know. The responses came instantly: disbelief, then recognition, then action. 6 men in different parts of the state read the message and began to move. They'd been gathering for a reunion 40 minutes away, old warriors telling older stories. Now they had a mission. Tyler reached into his graduation gown and pulled out a small pin, his valedictorian medal, gold and gleaming. This belongs to my father. Every late night he stayed up with me. Every sacrifice he made without complaint. Every time he chose my future over his comfort. This is his achievement. Dad, I know you won't come up here. I know you'll say this is my day. But I need everyone to know that you don't just wear that jacket. You've earned it every single day since you chose me over everything else. Ben's eyes burned, but his training held. SEALs don't cry in public. They endure. They persist. They watch their sons become men and feel their hearts break with pride in private. But his throat had closed, and his hands, steady enough to defuse bombs, trembled against the fence. Principal Wilcox stood, sensing the moment demanded management. She approached the podium, gently placing a hand on Tyler's shoulder. Thank you for that moving tribute, Mr. Walker. Now, perhaps we can return to Tyler. Stepped back, but didn't sit down. Instead, He faced his father and did something that stopped every heart in attendance. He saluted. Not the casual gesture of a teenager, but a crisp, military salute, learned from watching his father teach it to other veterans' children, practiced in mirrors when he thought no one was looking. Ben's hand rose automatically, returning the salute with precision that 2 decades couldn't erase. The crowd watched this silent exchange, and something shifted in the atmosphere. Dan Shepard stood first, followed by his wife, then Walt Greer, using his cane for support. One by one, people rose from their seats not in applause, which would come later, but in something older, more primal, respect for something they didn't fully understand, but recognized as profound. It was then that the whispers truly began. Walt Greer, unable to contain himself, leaned to the man beside him. That's Benjamin Walker, SEAL Team 11, the Phantom Commander. The name rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. The Phantom Commander? The one from the documentary? The one who saved those Marines? 32 operations without a single KIA? The whispers grew, gained substance, became a current of recognition flowing through the crowd. Marissa Whitmore heard the words from her position on stage, and the memory finally surfaced. Her younger brother, Daniel, had been a private in the Marines, part of a unit pinned down in Kandahar province. The official report had been sanitized, but Daniel had told her the truth during one of his rare moments of vulnerability. A SEAL team had come through hellfire to extract them, their commander personally carrying 2 wounded Marines to safety while under heavy fire. Daniel had said the commander's name once. Walker. Benjamin Walker. Her brother had lived because of the man now standing by the fence like an intruder at his own son's graduation. She rose from her mahogany chair, her movement drawing attention. Principal Wilcox looked relieved, assuming Marissa would restore order. Instead, Marissa descended the stage steps with unusual purpose. The crowd parted as she walked, they always did for money and power. She approached Ben directly, and for a moment, they stood facing each other, the CEO in her tailored suit, and the warrior in his faded jacket. "Mr. Walker," she said, loud enough for others to hear, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. You should be seated with the honored guests." She gestured toward the stage, toward the mahogany chairs reserved for dignitaries. Ben shook his head slightly. "I'm fine here, ma'am. I came to see my son, not to be seen." The response struck Marissa with unexpected force. When had she last done anything without considering how it would be seen? She managed perceptions like chess pieces, crafted images like weapons. This man had commanded some of America's most elite warriors and now stood content by a fence. "Your son said you're the reason he's valedictorian," she pressed. "Surely that earns you a better view." "I can see him from here," Ben replied simply. "That's all I need." Before Marissa could respond, a sound cut through the morning air, footsteps in perfect synchronization, measured and deliberate. The crowd turned toward the entrance, where 6 men in black suits walked in formation. They moved with the controlled grace of predators, their presence immediately commanding attention. One had a slight limp he refused to favor. Another bore a scar across his jaw that his beard couldn't quite hide. The man in front had steel-gray hair streaked with premature white dark sunglasses that reflected nothing, and hands that had stories written in every callus. They walked through the center aisle without asking permission, without acknowledging the stares. Parents pulled children closer, instinctively recognizing something dangerous made temporarily safe. The formation was perfect, 2 columns of 3, spacing exact to the inch. They'd practiced this movement in places where precision meant survival, and muscle memory didn't forget. Principal Wilcox moved to intercept them. "Gentlemen, I'm sorry, but this is a private ceremony." The lead man removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes the color of winter oceans. "Ma'am, we're here for our commander." His voice carried the authority of someone who'd given orders in situations where failure meant death. "We heard he was being asked to stand by the fence." The principal's prepared response died in her throat. These men radiated a controlled violence that made her security guards look like children playing dress-up. The lead man's gaze swept past her, found Ben, and something passed between them, a conversation in microseconds that civilians couldn't read. Ben straightened, an involuntary response to the presence of his brothers. The 6 men altered their formation, creating a corridor. The lead man reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of cloth, deep navy blue with gold trim. He unfolded it with reverence, revealing the SEAL trident embroidered in the center, surrounded by 6 stars, 1 for each deployment they'd survived together. Below the trident, stitched in gold thread, Team 11, Forever Brothers. They walked toward Ben with the cloth held between them like a battle standard. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to understand they were witnessing something sacred. When they reached Ben, they stopped in perfect unison. The leader spoke, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Commander Walker, Your brothers remember. Your sacrifice was not unnoticed. Your honor was not forgotten. Ben's composure, held so carefully, cracked slightly. Jake, he said to the leader, you didn't need to. Yes, sir, we did. Jake's voice broke military protocol with emotion. We've carried this for 7 years, waiting for the right moment. Your son's achievement seems like that moment. He turned to Tyler, who had descended from the stage and stood frozen, watching fathers he'd never met honor his father he'd loved alone. Tyler Walker, your father led us through 17 operations in Afghanistan. He brought every man home alive. When the politicians wanted us to take unacceptable risks, he stood between us and them. When we were wounded, he carried us. When we were broken, he held us together. The man with the scar stepped forward. Martinez, sir. You remember Kandahar, the school extraction. You took shrapnel meant for me. He pulled up his sleeve, revealing a tattoo coordinates and a date. I got this so I'd never forget. My kids exist because you bled that day. The one with the limp spoke next. Thompson, sir. My leg got torn up in that IED outside Bagram. You carried me 4 miles to the extraction point. Doctors said if you'd been 5 minutes later, I'd have lost it. I danced with my daughter at her wedding last year because of those 4 miles. Each man had a story, a moment when Benjamin Walker had chosen their lives over his glory, their safety over his advancement. They spoke them simply, without embellishment, because truth needed no decoration. The crowd listened to tales of heroism that sounded like mythology, but carried the unmistakable weight of fact. When they finished, Jake held out the cloth to Tyler. This belongs to you now. Your father gave up his teams for you, but you should know what he gave up. You should know who he was before he became who you needed. Tyler accepted the cloth with shaking hands, then did something that surprised everyone, including Ben. He walked to the stage, to the trophy case where Whitmore Academy displayed its achievements, debate championships, science fair victories, academic distinctions. He opened the unlocked case and placed the sealcloth inside, arranging it carefully among the trophies. Then he turned to the crowd. This belongs here, Tyler said, his voice steady now. Because this school talks about excellence, about achievement, about legacy. My father's legacy isn't in medals or missions.